Good morning. Welcome to the 21st Century Road to Housing Act, what it means for New Hampshire. Sponsored by the Initiative for Housing Policy and Practice at Saint Anselm College, and also sponsored by the BIA New Hampshire, New Hampshire Housing Authorities Corporation, New Hampshire Community Loan Fund, Housing Action, New Hampshire Housing, CDFA, and the Business and Economic Affairs State Department, New Hampshire. A lot of sponsors. That's because there's a lot of interest in improving the housing situation in New Hampshire, as we all know. One of the most recent stories on the NHBR website is how the median housing price in New Hampshire is now 580,000, inching towards 600,000. We probably will see that pretty soon. And if you're a renter, you need to make about $35 an hour to afford the typical two-bedroom home. And that's based on a 73,000 a year income, where the median is more like 52. We all know this. We all see the price of renting and housing going up no matter how you go at it. There is a fact sheet that lives on the Housing Act's New Hampshire website. I'm going to read just a little bit about it, and it has a lot of information. But the Housing Act passed by Congress in June became law on July 10th. We know it's a bipartisan bill, and that became law, rare in this administration. The final legislation combines provisions from more than 60 bipartisan bills introduced in the House and Senate. While the act creates several new federal grants, most of the new programs will require future congressional appropriations before funding becomes available. That's a quick way of saying this is just the beginning. A lot has to happen. But as we've seen in the state of New Hampshire with bills mostly passed in the last legislature, there are things that move. This is almost like the federal government is mirroring what New Hampshire's been trying to just pick at different things that will help the situation. But this is a long-term process. Our panelists today are Alyssa Margolin, who's the director of the Initiative for Housing Policy and Practice at Saint Anselm College, Nick Taylor, executive director, Housing Action, New Hampshire, Jack Ruderman, legislative affairs advisor for New Hampshire Housing, and Sarah Marchant, chief operating officer for the New Hampshire Community Loan Fund. Thank you all for being here today. We're going to kick off with Alyssa. Congress rarely passes comprehensive housing legislation. Put this in context. Why is this considered the most significant housing law in decades?
Well, thank you, Mike, and good morning, everyone. I want to start, Mike, by thanking New Hampshire Business Review for hosting this webinar. All the organizations you named who helped curate that fact sheet on the 21st Century Road to Housing Act that's posted on the Housing Action New Hampshire website, as well as my colleagues from Housing Action New Hampshire, New Hampshire Community Loan Fund, and New Hampshire Housing coming together this morning for this webinar. So you asked the question, Mike, what is this really the biggest bill in a generation? Some have called it, some have called it the biggest bill in decades. I don't know if it's like a bigger bill than the original, Housing Act of 1949, but it is a big deal because it takes 60 bills that already were moving in Congress and brings them together to essentially modernize the toolbox. There are not a lot of new tools, but I mean, an analogy I was trying to think of this morning is like, it's like you used to have a drill that you had to plug in the wall, but now a lot of people use cordless drills, or perhaps you had to, pour gasoline into your leaf blower, and now you have a battery you can do that with. That's a little bit like the Road to Housing Act, and maybe we can just call it Road for short this morning. It's also a bill that focuses on supply. A lot of federal legislation has been about affordability or addressing housing for specific populations, whether that's veterans or people who are facing housing instability or rural development in rural areas. And this is essentially looks at housing across across the policy spectrum and thinks of it in terms of supply and says, how can we modernize and how can we make these tools more useful given this modern context? And how can we make it more flexible for our housing partners? And then there's little bits of incentives to say we'll reward you with more of these resources and more of these tools if you start to address the supply. But for the most part, it provides just, more flexibility and more utility for those current programs. And if I could, I'd love to share an example, and I know Jack Ruderman from New Hampshire Housing will give us more detail on this. But back in 2015, some of the attendees this morning and the folks who covered it at New Hampshire Business Review may remember that 72 New Hampshire families almost found themselves displaced with less than 30 days notice in the Upper Valley because a little known program called the USDA Rural Development 515 program was a clunky program from the 1950s that essentially said that we fund this program to get the mortgage and the rental assistance together. And that mortgage matured when and kind of no one was looking. Like a lot of times that'll happen to you when you start to retire a debt. You didn't realize, oh, I got so much closer than I thought to my last payment. And that when that mortgage matured, that means all of the rental assistance that was benefiting the disabled and elderly residents there, what disappeared and created this instability. And it was actually us in New Hampshire who got together to look at a solution to updating that program. And it was Congresswoman Annie Custer at the time and Senator Shaheen who filed bills in Congress, the first bills to update that program. And yes, 10 years later, that their recommendations became law in the road bill. And you'll hear from Jack on why that matters and the opportunities that that gives all of us to update those properties and to use that program for the benefit of New Hampshire residents. Um, and then I think another part to think about this bill is about capital and liquidity. We know that there are federal resources, but sometimes they were set out to just do one specific thing. And it didn't really help us with the supply program. And you'll hear a lot of discussions about economic development tools like the Community Development Block Grant and other tools that before you could not use specifically to build new units, and now you can. And so that's exciting. And then I think I'll close with this before you ask your next question to the other panelists, and that is um, to think about the fact that New Hampshire has been on the right track. So you've seen a lot of policy reforms come out of our state legislature in the last couple of years that are reflected in this road bill. You'll also see some moves that New Hampshire made early on, particularly around manufactured housing, where the rest of the country is kind of catching up. So I look forward to this morning's discussion and thank you again for hosting this.
Thanks, Alyssa. Jack, from New Hampshire Housing's perspective, what do you see are the biggest opportunities in this bill?
Thanks for the question, Mike, and thanks for having me on the panel. It's great to be here today, and thrilled that we have such a big audience. Thanks to everybody tuning in. I have to say that figuring out what to say this morning proved to be a bigger challenge than I anticipated. Road is such a monumental and wide-ranging piece of legislation that it's really challenging to identify what the biggest opportunities are. But with limited time here, I'm going to focus on just 4 provisions that I think are particularly important from New Hampshire Housing's perspective. Alyssa set me up here to talk about the first topic, which is Section 502, the Rural Housing Service Reform Act. So USDA has this Section 515 program that over the years has helped finance roughly 90 multifamily developments in rural areas in New Hampshire, providing more than 2,000 units of affordable rental, mostly apartments, in rural communities. And under the current program rules, as Alyssa explained, rental assistance just ends when the USDA mortgage is paid off, even if the owner wants to keep the property affordable and keep the tenants in that housing. So what Section 502 does is it solves that problem by decoupling the rental assistance from the mortgage. And that means that the owners can continue serving low-income tenants after the mortgage expires. Most of the New Hampshire Section 515 mortgages are scheduled to expire between 2028 and 2047. So this change could have a major impact on the preservation of rural affordable housing. And, kudos to all the legislators Alyssa cited, and a special shout out to Senator Shaheen and her staff, because in the years leading up to this, I believe Senator Shaheen was successful in establishing a pilot decoupling program. So we sort of had proof of concept. The second area I want to highlight is the bill's effort to streamline environmental reviews. So the Road Act contains several provisions designed to reduce duplicative reviews and accelerate project delivery. So, for example, it expands exemptions and categorical exclusions for small scale and infill housing, allows many projects to move forward with a single environmental review rather than multiple reviews, and directs HUD and USDA to develop a joint review process for projects funded by both agencies. Because right now they're pretty much stovepiped, and that results in ridiculous inefficiencies and redundancies for developers who've got to get, environmental approvals from both agencies. So the common theme with all these provisions, and there are a lot of them, is to lower compliance costs, less delay, and a faster path to construction. And that's really critical because for project developers, delays aren't just inconvenient. They can cause all sorts of issues with their financing, and ultimately they make projects more expensive. So it's really critical to shorten the time frame for those projects, and the environmental review process is the biggest thing that tends to drag it out. The third area I would highlight is Section 203, which is the Community Investment and Prosperity Act. So this provision increases the public welfare investment cap for national banks and certain other financial institutions from 15% to 20%. For New Hampshire housing, this matters because banks are major investors in low-income housing tax credits. And that's the low-income housing tax credit is our flagship program for funding new multifamily affordable housing. We expect that the higher cap, and that's a significant boost from 15 to 20%, will support additional investment demand, which probably will help strengthen tax credit pricing and provide developers with more equity to finance affordable housing projects. So that also to us is one of the highlights of this bill. Finally, I want to mention Section 501, which reauthorizes and modernizes something called the Home Investment Partnerships Program, which is run by HUD. So the home program is an important resource for us. It provides critical gap financing for affordable housing developments. And the bill reauthorizes this program, which has been operating without formal congressional authorization for decades, which is problematic for a number of reasons. It also streamlines the program requirements, and it directs HUD to review the impact of the notorious Build America, Buy America program that has been so challenging and problematic for housing developers. So to sort of wrap it up, when I look at the Road to Housing Act, through the lens of New Hampshire housing, I see three themes, major themes. One, preserving existing affordable housing. Two, reducing unnecessary regulatory barriers to new construction. And three, attracting more capital to housing development. No single provision that I have touched on or that you're going to hear about from Sarah and Nick will solve our longstanding and sort of deep-rooted housing challenges. But together, these reforms definitely have the potential to make it easier to preserve affordable homes, to finance new development, and deliver housing more quickly in communities across New Hampshire. That's why we do see this legislation as a significant step forward. And we look forward to working with our partners here on the panel and elsewhere to implement these changes in the years ahead. So that's what I've got for you, and I'll turn it back to you, Mike. Thanks.
Thank you, Jack. This is a question for Sarah Marchant. There has been a lot of attention on the manufacturing housing sections of this bill, particularly the new definition of manufactured housing that no longer requires the chassis or metal structure with wheels. Practically, what does that mean in New Hampshire for residents living in manufactured housing and the opportunities to grow this type of affordable home ownership?
Yes, thank you. I think this actually it goes well with Alyssa's analogy earlier of putting a battery into the weed whacker instead of having to use some of the older parts. So while we will not see changes tomorrow necessarily on this, the vast majority of homes in New Hampshire will probably for a while still come with the chassis and wheels attached. The difference is today they come with the chassis and wheels and axles attached. The axle and wheels are removed and they are permanently affixed to a foundation in New Hampshire. This law is innovative and it would require New Hampshire to update its definition of manufactured housing. But what it allows for is the innovation in the new types of building design and the removal of the chassis on site. So that piece doesn't stay with the home, reducing costs, but also allowing these homes to be placed flat on a foundation, flat on a frost wall foundation or a slab, and having them be modernized with housing that is more traditional looking. What we've also seen across the country in areas where this type has already been allowed to be used is that these homes can actually be designed to be stacked, to be two-story homes. We've actually seen quite a proliferation, excuse me, of cross-mod homes too. That's CROSS, capital MOD. And this is the newest version of manufactured housing. It really allows for innovation. These are net zero ready, highly efficient, different pitched roofs with attached garages and porches. And so the idea here is that while it still provides for an incredibly affordable national code for homes to be built under, allowing for that scaling up and keeping them very affordable, it also allows for modern innovation in these homes so that we can provide additional supply at a really affordable. I just want to add, it's really important to note that manufactured housing, the home ownership here, these are real estate in New Hampshire. They are appreciating assets, and they are probably the only home that you will find listed if you looked in MLS for under $200,000. And in the last year or so, we've seen more than half of all the mortgages we've done gone to first-time home buyers, because you heard the numbers that Mike talked about early on, and these are actually affordable homes that you can purchase, build equity in for less than renting a two-bedroom apartment. So they're an incredibly important part of the home ownership story here in New Hampshire.
Thanks, Sarah. That reminds me of overpaying for a home in Naples, Florida in the 90s for 200,000. And yeah, it's worth like 1.2 million now. Follow-up question. There has been some confusion over the homes are for people, not corporations provision in Title 10. This does not apply to manufactured housing. Can you explain why this is the case and whether this remains a challenge in New Hampshire?
Yeah. So you may have heard about this nationally as far as the road to housing goes with the inability for private equity to purchase single family homes anymore. That's what this provision, this Title X provision is about. It does not apply to manufactured homes. And I think really importantly here in New Hampshire, as they have been titled as real estate all along, it doesn't apply to manufactured home communities, right? When a community is bought and sold, it is the land and infrastructure underneath the homes that are the actual purchase and the transfer in that case. It's not the homes. These homes are already owned by the homeowners. And so this provision does nothing to change how the land and infrastructure in manufactured home communities is bought and sold here in New Hampshire or anywhere in the country. In New Hampshire, we started the resident owned communities program over 40 years ago. We have 153 resident owned communities in New Hampshire. And when a seller of a community decides to sell to the residents, to a private buyer, or to an out of state private equity firm, those choices are not at all affected by the road to housing.
Thank you, Sarah. This question is for Nick Taylor. How well do these federal reforms align with New Hampshire's recent housing reforms?
Yeah, thanks, Mike, for the question, and thanks for having us. They align really well. I mean, there's a couple of things from a philosophical and political standpoint and from a policy standpoint. And so, as Alyssa said at the top, from like a big picture perspective, the fact that in New Hampshire, we've passed a lot of bipartisan, overwhelmingly bipartisan regulatory reforms. We saw the exact same thing with the road bill here with the overwhelming bipartisan support and that focus on expanding housing options. So often we talk about there's not one silver bullet in the housing shortage and the housing crisis. It's going to take a lot of different options that meet the needs of different communities, different lot sizes, different family structures, and different times in individuals' lives. And we saw that same sentiment play out in this bill as the components were being put together. And so specifically, there are some things that New Hampshire has been sort of on the front lines of that showed up in this bill, and some things certainly that will be tweaked going forward. But some examples. I mean, Sarah just talked about this. Of New Hampshire for a long time has been considering manufactured homes real estate and not for personal property. So something that showed up in the bill that aligns with New Hampshire law that is New Hampshire being ahead of the curve. Over the last couple of years, we've seen single stair reform, which is not a super sexy, but a code reform element that aims at creating sort of more smaller multifamily buildings on narrower lots that don't necessarily need to have the two staircases without compromising on fire safety. That showed up in this bill. There's potential grant programs down the road for planning and zoning best practices. We saw that with our HOP program here in New Hampshire, where there were grants out to the communities, and some of the work that the Department of Business and Economic Affairs and their Office of Planning and Development did with the New Hampshire Housing Toolbox. So making sure that the best practices are out there. We've seen some communities like the city of Lebanon pursue pattern zoning, so pre-approved plans. There's a grant program in here that would allow for municipalities and states to take advantage of that and try and take that, broader. We also saw here in Section 303 that dealt with some of the FHA changes to manufactured housing lending, also included some updated guidance around ADU loans and how those can be insured. And so when we think about how do the state and federal governments work together, that's a great example of at the state level and local level, we legalize detached ADUs, and at the federal level, they're opening up some flexibility on the financing. When those two things start to come together, that's how you can see everyone sort of chipping away at their own barriers and getting more of these built.
Thanks, Nick. Since any new funding streams in this package still require congressional appropriations, what does that mean for housing advocacy going into the budget year at the State House? Also, Sarah shared that the limits on institutional investors don't apply to manufactured housing, but do apply to residential single family. Will that have any impact in the state?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, great question. So, I mean, the funding one is a really good one. It's important to realize sort of what this bill is and what it isn't. It is a real combination of a lot of really great regulatory reforms and authorizes future grant programs and future funding programs. It is not an appropriations bill, and it is not a fully fleshed out rules and regulations bill that means that as soon as some of these programs are enacted, that the rules and application process will immediately open up. It sort of creates a roadmap for how we could go forward. And so when we think about the funding pieces, this bill came out of a policy committee, an authorizing committee. It didn't come out of the appropriations committee. So some of the things we're talking about, like the grant programs, those would still need to show up in a future federal budget. And so we're kind of creating the buckets that are, have labels on them and tell you exactly what it would go to, but they're not filled yet. So they will need to go through the appropriations stamp process. And, we've talked about, and many of the folks who are tuning in here do a lot of work on below market rate housing, knowing how important the financial public-private partnerships are there when we think about, whether it's at the state level, the Affordable Housing Fund or the CDFA tax credits, or things like, nationally home funds, CDBG funds, housing trust funds. All of that will still need to be part of this equation when we think about how do we get, more below market and deeply affordable housing built, and that will be a future budget conversation. And then, quickly to your point on the institutional investor provision, I think Sarah's clarification was a really good one, because we've seen so many, recent news stories and concerning instances of manufactured home parks being purchased and seeing rents increased. But when we think about the institutional investor provision for single family homes, this is a bigger issue in sort of the Sun Belt and Western parts of the country, where you see these larger subdivisions, single family subdivisions that can be purchased all at once. In New Hampshire, we just don't have that available greenfield development. We don't see that same activity that we've seen in some other parts of the country. But it's an important provision in there because it's a protection. And and when you have a individual family who's trying to get their foot in the door, trying to go up against a Wall Street firm, they're going to lose pretty much every time when it comes to the kind of offer that they can put together. And the bill itself sets a threshold of 350 single family homes, as that's the cap on institutional owning. And so when you think about, you could own 350 or 349 in another state, and if you purchase one in New Hampshire, that would hit your threshold. So there is some good protections there. There was, and I think we got a question of this really in the chat briefly. Originally, there was a version that included some prohibition on building new single family homes that were for the purpose of renting. And so this sort of build to rent provision that came out of the bill in review, which we supported it coming out, because we know that renting a single family home is also an option for people that may need it. And so trying to say you can't build new single family homes because you're going to rent them, we didn't think that was a good idea, but that didn't make it into the final version.
All right, now we're moving to a lightning round question. The Road to Housing Act gives New Hampshire new tools. They have a big toolbox full of tools. What are you going to do with them? What's the one thing the legislature, state agencies, developers, or advocates do next to make the most of these tools?
Well, I'll jump in, Mike, and perhaps I'll exploit sponsorship privilege and pick two, if that's okay. I would say, of the two things, I think how New Hampshire can respond to the opportunity created by Road would be providing, restoring in many ways, and making sure that there is a real public-private partnership happening at the state level through the Affordable Housing Fund. So a lot of tools like the low-income housing tax credit, the 515, the CDBG, and a lot of stuff that you heard, the alphabet soup that you heard from the panelists this morning, pencil out and work well when you have a state partner. And most states have made sure that they have a funding formula so that the state can be part of the development of new supply. And New Hampshire, not surprisingly, we've struggled in that area. So as we go into a budget year, I would think that making sure the Affordable Housing Fund is funded adequately will be important in order to take advantage of this new federal law. And then I guess my second response is there's an opportunity here for better planning. And at the Initiative for Housing Policy and Practice at Saint Anselm College, we work to steward the New Hampshire Zoning Atlas. And it has become a really important tool, I think, for communities and regions to use in order to implement better zoning, in order to use these new tools to address the supply issues. And that doesn't mean that we are going to get rid of our rural character or beautiful green space or the conservation land we're all so proud of. It means we're going to plan better to use the parcels that make sense for development and build in a way that create vibrant communities. And so, for example, one of the sections of this bill will require any community that uses community development block grant funding to have a database of publicly owned land assets. And the New Hampshire Zoning Atlas now has a screening tool specifically just for that. And so we'll be able to work with the state and regions and municipalities in order to screen those publicly owned parcels and provide them with a tool that says this is a good place for you to consider enhancing supply. So we look forward to continuing to expand the use of the New Hampshire Zoning Atlas for that purpose and respond to these new opportunities.
Let's go with Sarah. Sarah, how would you respond to this toolbox question?
I think manufactured homes are already New Hampshire's largest source of a naturally occurring affordable home ownership. More than 6 to 7% of all of the single family homes in New Hampshire today. And this is the only affordable path to attaining home ownership today for many families. So the next step here is to make sure we truly leverage the tools of the Road to Housing Act by removing unnecessary barriers to off-site housing construction, ensuring manufactured homes can be placed where single family homes are allowed, and preserving and expanding opportunities for residents to purchase their communities when they come up for sale. If we do that, we can truly expand home ownership without subsidy, although I agree with the Affordable Housing Trust Fund appropriations, and we can create more housing that working families can actually afford in New Hampshire, where they can build equity and a solid economic future.
Thank you, Sarah. Nick, how would you respond with Housing Action New Hampshire?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question because there's sort of the big picture of like the implementation piece that we're all talking about that's so important. I mean, we've talked about this with the state level work too. Of it's great that you pass a bill, but we need to make sure it gets implemented properly and that the homes actually get built. And so when you think about all the different federal changes here and the whether it's new programs at HUD or other studies or regulatory reform pieces, the implementation piece and keeping our foot on the gas will be really important there. But one specific section that I'm very interested in and think will have a very interesting future certainly is Section 213, which is updates this the CDBG funding for the entitlement communities. And so it's looking at this Build Now Act that was incorporated. And what it does is it actually incentivizes with additional CDBG funds if a community is building more housing, and it penalizes communities that are high demand communities that are not building more housing. And so there are 6 entitlement communities within New Hampshire in the CDBG program: Concord, Dover, Manchester, Nashua, Portsmouth, and Rochester. And so the way this provision works is, if you're a high demand market, and so there's some screening tools laid out in the law around what is a high demand market and what isn't. So you're not penalizing, states and regions that don't have the same demand that we have here in New Hampshire. But if you're a high demand market and you are building more housing, if you're above the median housing production or you're building 4% or more units, you're getting an increase in your CDBG funds. And if you're not, you're going to get a decrease. And now it's on the margins. It's only max 10% increase, max 10% decrease. But when we think about actually getting results on all this and building the homes that our businesses need, that our workers need, like this type of program that is saying, we don't really care exactly how you get there, but you got to build more housing, is a really interesting case study in how this will play out. And like very excited to see it work. And if you're an entitlement community in New Hampshire, the next step is starting to build more housing. So you're going to be part of that incentivized 10% increase section.
Thanks, Nick. Jack Ruderman, New Hampshire Housing, how do you see these tools helping what you do?
Well, I would start by saying, even though it's not the most exciting thing in the world, for us, because we work so closely with HUD and receive a significant amount of funding from HUD, um, we're really awaiting guidance from HUD on how all these new program reforms and rules um, are translated into actual, policy. So for us, sort of the first step is just really following closely what HUD is doing, so we can be nimble and make changes to our programs as soon as we get that guidance. Um, um, I also want to just follow up a little bit about the Affordable Housing Fund. I just want to mention for folks who aren't aware of it, the Affordable Housing Fund was created by the legislature in 1988. That's a program that we administer. Um, so far, since 1988, we've received about 103 million in state funding. We basically put all of that money into the program. Our administrative costs are about 1%, and it's a revolving loan fund. So we get a lot of mileage out of it, and it's highly leveraged. So we've done a total of 142 projects, and that's leveraged like $775 million dollars and helped preserve or developed 4,600 units of housing. And in terms of funding, we, by statute, get an allocation each year of $5 million from the real estate transfer tax. So, that's a really critical tool for us. The Road Act isn't going to provide any additional funding for that. But to the extent that the state wants to boost funding, for that, we could certainly put it to good use. And that works very well with all of the sources of funding we have, from the tax credits to the HUD home program to the HUD housing trust fund program, et cetera. So it's all part of a bigger package and gets back to, the public-private partnership that Alyssa was referring to.
Thanks, Jack. Any other thoughts on the toolbox before we move on to another question?
I should add one quick correction to my point about the CDBG pieces. There are actually 5 entitlement communities in New Hampshire. Concord is not an entitlement community for the CDBG fund. So thank you to the folks who let me know that.
Thanks, Nick. And I feel like I have this great advantage of all these housing experts in front of me here, and I'm older than all of you. And I just did a quick search on Google to remind myself this is the Great Recession, a severe global economic downturn lasting from December 2007 to June 2009. I say wrong. I think we never got out of it. I mean, talk about how this housing crisis started like 20 years ago almost now, and we were still living through it. Tell me how you think about how this problem took a long time to become the problem it is now, which is scary to think it takes a long time to solve these big infrastructure problems.
Yeah, I mean, Mike, I'm glad you raised the subprime mortgage crisis of 2008 because at that time was when we really saw the price of rental housing skyrocket. What you had with the foreclosure crisis, with families moving out of home ownership into rental housing, you also had the up and coming millennial generation going through their housing cycle, staying in rental housing longer because they were unable to secure mortgages for home ownership because of student debt. And then you just had the regular rental market, and we had a severe undersupply. But because the culture and our was talking about falling prices of housing, it was very difficult to let policymakers know that we were headed to a crisis. But we could see the signs right there. that we didn't have enough flexibility in New Hampshire's supply. Due to then of course the pandemic made it so much worse. So if you are now someone with a relatively high starting salary and you want to relocate to New Hampshire, not only are you dealing with the high cost that you mentioned at the top, a median price of 580 to buy, a starting salary of 73 in order to rent. There's very little available. I think the New Hampshire Realtors in your piece from today or yesterday said that supply's up a little bit, but they can really arrive with a job offer and just have no choice nearby where their job is offered. So if it's hard for, say, a new medical resident or a young engineer to arrive to New Hampshire to contribute to our state, you can imagine what it's like for a single parent with a couple of kids who's been navigating the rental market, staying in the rental market with all these changes and trying to provide stability, say, to keep the kids in the local schools. We have such a severe history over the last probably 40 years of undersupply that it's just going to take a while to get out. So we'll use all the tools and all the partnership we can in order to keep, making a dent and preserving naturally occurring affordable housing or, federally assisted housing that we have in play.
Someone else want to comment?
I mean, I think, it's such a great question, but I think we've also seen this in some of the public data and polling data too, because, there's often can be a disconnect between sort of public perception and some of the numbers we're seeing on the ground. And the Initiative for Housing Policy and Practice has done such great public research on this too. And so when we see this idea of like, well, how did we kind of get here where we had the political will to pass such a big, broad package with bipartisan support at a time when, when you're tackling big issues, you rarely have bipartisan support on anything. Like we've really started to see that change. And I mean, even looking over the last, 5 to 7, 10 years, the numbers back up that folks really want more housing. They're seeing it in their lives. They're seeing it in their kids' lives. They're seeing it in their colleagues' lives. If they're a small business owner, they can't hire people, like Alyssa said. And so I think when you have the policy components, you have the public opinion, that is how you start to bring these pieces together to be able to tackle some of these big issues. And it's not to say that this bill is going to solve everything and put us on, a glide path to, affordable housing everywhere. But, we know that the answer to this is building more homes that are attainable to people. And that's what this is, all about.
Thanks, Nick. Sarah or Jack, you want to add anything to that?
I think so. It's all well said.
Before we take, I'll have one more question before we go on to questions from the audience. Would you say because we're and this is like from your professional work, the whole idea of affordable housing has shifted in the last 5, 10 years? I mean, I reported about affordable housing many years ago as a reporter, and it was apartments for people maybe who were working in the hotels. Now we hear of, people who they're the college educated sons and daughters of bankers and law partners who are saving money to afford their first house. Is that helping to push some of the legislation along and to get further attention to solve the problems?
Yeah, I can jump in for a second.
Thanks,
I
Sam.
think New Hampshire has a really long tradition of home ownership, and we believe in home ownership truly as part of our culture. And what we've seen is that it's rising to the level that not only can young people who we value and our kids not move back to the state and not be able to buy houses, or our young people that we're trying to recruit into our jobs, but we're also seeing it being really hard to downsize and to find anything affordable to stay in your community that you have built over all these years and that you truly care about. And now that it's affecting all echelons of the population and all different age groups, I think we're really seeing a lot more of a call to action that maybe the rules and regulations that we put in place with really good intentions
Mhm.
aren't actually deriving the outcomes we want. And now it's time for we're kind of late and we have makeup work to do to really catch up and make sure that New Hampshire is still a place that you can afford to purchase a home, that you can afford to live, that you can afford to recruit employees to. And I think that that is part of why this has been changed. And honestly, construction in its traditional sense had not changed in a really long
Mhm.
time either. And there is so much new technology and really awesome ways of standardizing supply and finding new ways to address what it is a home. How do we construct a home? How do we do so affordably? That we need to modernize with the standards of also what the different generations need. Because what you choose to downsize into or what a first time home buyer may choose to purchase may not be what 20 years ago was
Mhm.
the dream of having a 4-bedroom house on 2 acres. And so making sure that we're providing options has also become more main.
Thanks, Sarah.
Yeah, New
This is a
Hampshire
question.
housing.
Go
Oh,
ahead.
sorry, Mike.
Go
I was
ahead.
going
Go
to
ahead,
say
Nick.
New Hampshire housing has to that same point. Like New Hampshire housing has this great, yeah, in their study, who can afford to live in New Hampshire, has this great chart where you're seeing who's cost burdened. And so cost burdened being you're spending more than 30% of your income on your housing costs. And so what we've seen is the folks who have been at the lowest percentiles have always been, incredibly high percentage of them are cost burdened. And that has been an
Mhm.
issue for a long, long time. What we're seeing is significant increases in folks who are making, $70,000. You could really just see the graph go
Yeah.
up, and those folks are also becoming cost burdened at a much, much higher level. And so that's where I think you're seeing the continued momentum too. And it's in some ways it's like disappointing that it takes that many more folks to be in a challenging situation for there to be significant action. But at the same time, when you ask like, how is this kind of resonating? How are you seeing this show up in other
Mhm.
sort of higher income lines of work? Um, the data really, really backs that up, and that chart is pretty stark.
Yeah, to that end, we hear stories of employers bringing people in and they're offering $70,000 and they're getting people not coming because they can't find homes. They got kids, whatever it is, those issues. So it's a much bigger picture. Anyone else on
What?
this topic?
Yeah, I was going to say, we also have um, a chart or a graph that we put together showing the relationship between income levels and housing prices and how much you have to spend as a multiple of income to buy a home. And 10 years ago, it might have been like 2.5, right? So you'd go to your financial planner or you'd go to your bank and they'd say, look, you earn 100,000, so you could probably buy a home, reasonably for about 250,000, without putting yourself in that category of being
Mhm.
cost burden for housing. Um, and now that ratio has gone all the way up to, I think, around 5 times annual income to buy a house. So it is hitting people, as Nick said, it's not, it used to be more people at the lower end of the income scale and maybe, middle end of the scale. But now, you can have a couple, they're both high earners, and they still have to spend an enormous sum to buy that 3 or 4 bedroom home that they want with a couple of baths and a yard.
Or they owned the home for a while and they're not going to move because they couldn't afford to buy the house that they're in. Right?
Right. Exactly right. Yeah.
This is a question from Ryan Donnelly. Are there any provisions in the bill that will incentivize the construction of affordable housing units that are accessible for people with disabilities, such as wheelchair users? The availability of housing in New Hampshire that is both accessible and affordable is very small.
I'll take that. Hi, Ryan. Great to have you from Ryan from GSIL. As at the initiative, we have a leadership group of disability leaders working on policy recommendations to address the housing crisis for people with IDD. So I too was looking through the bill for this, and I will say that, like I said earlier, the bill doesn't really focus, although it does mention veterans. It doesn't really focus population by population. And there is not enough in here when you really think about some of the challenges that people with disabilities are facing in the housing community. I'll call out that, it does ask HUD to consider some design issues. And um, so, that's that again, that innovation and that modernization that Sarah talked about earlier. And there's also some the banking element where regulated banks are required to spend a certain amount of their capital and community on what's called the public welfare. And it does raise that amount. I believe it's from 20% to 30%. And it does name disability housing in that section as well. But it's not called out by population. And I guess as I dig into the policy challenges for housing for people with disabilities, there are issues that come up related to um, Medicaid reimbursement, the settings rule, Olmstead Act settlement, and design. So I would say the opportunities in this bill are around design, and the others are not included in the Road Act.
Anyone else want to comment on this one? Here's a question from Bob Benson. Will road help the build to rents market?
I can take this one. So you mentioned this
Excellent.
briefly. There was originally some provisions in this bill that were explicitly aimed at stopping the build to rent market. So typically what that is describing is single family construction with the full intention of renting those single family homes. It's not typically described as building, new apartment buildings that are designed to be rental units. And so there was a provision in a previous version of Road that prohibited sort of that new construction, or at least allowed the new construction, but you had to sell it within 7 years. And so there was some concern around, if that was a model for new construction for that type of housing production, that you're basically stopping that from happening. And when we talk about housing options, we shouldn't, from our perspective, we shouldn't be in the regulatory environment of trying to prevent certain housing from being built. The goal should be trying to build more housing because some people do want to rent a single family home, and that's the right stage for them in their lives and their careers or what have you. And so that provision came out, and so there's nothing in Road that prevents the build to rent provision. I think when you think about will it help the build to rent pieces, some of the other streamlining elements, some of the other cutting of red tape, some of the other regulatory reform pieces certainly could see some of that, but it certainly wasn't written with that type of housing in mind when we're talking about the proactive policies.
Thanks, Nick. Here's a question and some commentary from Tim Harris. It says, I read the bill twice. Please discuss who benefits and who doesn't. This bill is not helping the fresh college grad or the young couple looking for their first home. It helps those who build mini homes or RVs on a large scale. It helps real estate investment trusts and other property investment groups. It may adversely affect 2 to 5% of that group that own more than 350 properties. But since there's no teeth or enforcement to look good in front of the camera, why isn't HUD here since they are the only actionable agency? Lightning rod.
I love it. I love it. So I saw that comment and I thought it was great and it's great to challenge us here. I think it's really important to think of this bill as a practitioner's bill. It's really in the weeds on a lot of existing tools in the toolbox. And you recall when Vice President Kamala Harris was running for president, she had a housing platform that wanted to give funding directly to people who wanted to buy a home. And that is why I think from a political perspective, an electoral perspective, that she was behind that, although uh, uh, you know, didn't end up serving her in the end. But it's because practitioner bills don't really sound that great to the public. It's really like what's in it for me is not that clear. And so sometimes policymakers are like, here's what's in it for you, here's a check. But I do think that this bill is a bit of a miracle when it comes to cleaning up a bureaucratic mess of well-meaning tools that needed modernization. And I think that future renters and homeowners are going to benefit from those changes.
I would just add something. I have to confess that when I sat down to think about like what am I most excited about in this bill, um, it was the manufactured housing provisions, and I didn't want to steal any of Sarah's thunder. But I'm on the housing committee in my town. I mean, we've done a housing needs analysis, we've done surveys, outreach, whatever, and right, as already mentioned, you have a lot of seniors who want to downsize and they want to live in a single floor home and there are no options. They can't find anything. B, there are no starter homes. Like, I've got sons, adult sons, who want to buy homes. And if they wanted to move back to our town, there's virtually nothing there. And so when I saw the provision that was going to take out the chassis requirement for manufactured homes, I thought, thank God. People have been talking about this for decades about how just unhelpful or what a drag it is on manufactured housing. Um, and I'm not saying this is going to revolutionize manufactured housing, but it's just a recognition that we need to make it easier. And what also has to happen is there has to be a shift in public opinion about the aesthetics of manufactured homes, and people have to get comfortable with having them in their neighborhoods. Because in most towns, like my town, you can only have a manufactured home in a manufactured housing park. If you own an acre of land in a residential zone, you can't put it there. And so, and you can get a high quality manufactured home for a couple $100,000, right? New. And if you were to get a site built or stick built, as they say, comparable home, it's going to cost more. It's going to be $300,000 or $400,000. So, even though this is an immediate relief, and even though it has to be coupled, I think with some zoning changes in our state, I do think if you're a young person and you are, looking for some signal that the government cares about starter homes, they sent a pretty good one on manufactured housing.
Thanks, Jack. Nick or Sarah, you want to jump in on this one?
I appreciate, Tim, the thoughts and the points you're making. I think one thing that we, in addition to what other folks have said, this kind of conversation comes up in a lot of these regulatory reform pieces. We talk about it with ADUs, we talk about it with lot size reform, where you're in a situation where this may not be perfect, right? There could still be a higher end home built on a small lot. There still could be a ADU that's not specifically rented at workforce housing level. But when we think about what we're trying to do in the big pictures, we know that we need more homes. We know that we need to make it easier to build all different types of homes at various price points that will, in the long run, help with the affordability pieces and help with the attainability pieces and just get people moving into things that are right sized for them, whether that's because they're overhoused and need to downsize, or whether that's because they're looking for something, in the region or in a different area. And so, I think it's important to continue to do great advocacy, great work, but also not let the perfect be the enemy of the good in a situation where you're trying to tailor a policy to like this one specific type of individual at the expense of being able to do that at some scale. So I think it's a really good point. I appreciate the comments. But at the end of the day, when we think about how do we increase supply, being broad and flexible is a big piece of the puzzle.
Thanks, Nick.
I'll just jump in and add, I
Thanks,
think that Nick's point about the starter home, it's not that we don't build them because nobody wants to build them. We don't build them because the math doesn't work at this time. And so I do think what this bill does is it's trying to remove the regulatory barriers to allow for us to get to new ways of thinking and doing, because we haven't been able to get there on our own. We've proven over and over again that we aren't getting there. And so that we needed some regulatory relief and help to provide some ability to be more innovative and to not have duplicative regulations and ways that we can streamline process, which saves time, which saves money. I just want to clarify that, the big difference between a manufactured home and a modular home with this change is that the manufactured home is the only national standard HUD code. So it's the only code in the country. You can build a home. It doesn't matter what you're building, where the factory's building for, and it can be delivered on site. And so you can get to massive scale that way, but because there is no local customization of code, either at the state or local level. Modular homes are under the building code, which is customized at the state level and many times even more locally on repeat. And so that makes it really hard for those to get to scale and the savings over time right now in its current configuration. And I think what this bill is trying to do is to open up financing and open up some of the regulatory structures to help allow modular homes to get to some of the cost savings that they've been intended to be able to get to and have not yet achieved, largely because there are levels of customization that require refinement, and so you can't get to scale. And the manufactured home code allows you to do that nationally, which is a game changer.
Thanks, Sarah. Nick, you had a question that came up in the chat that you answered, but you wanted to share with the rest of the group.
Yeah, I think we've gotten a couple different questions on that CDBG funding piece of how things will move around. And Senator Reardon, I know you had asked the question, and now it's in the answered category of the Q&A, which are sort of what were the benchmarks for that adjustment with the CDBG piece. And so what they're looking at is new census addresses, which is a new data point put out through the census that's looking at new addresses as the construction measure. And so that first component is the sort of screening for high demand, and the thresholds there are, is your sales price above the median sales price around the country? Is your rental vacancy below the average rental vacancy rate? Is the HUD fair market rate above the 60th percentile around the country? And so that's your sort of high demand screening. And if you're not a high demand community, doesn't apply. If you are a high demand community, it does apply. Once you hit that high demand threshold, there's one way to guarantee that you're in the increase is if you have a 4% increase. And so a 4% increase, there will be a look back on this. And so it's not just like a snap of the fingers and, what did you do the last couple of years? It's being able to look forward. But if you have a 4% increase, you're automatically in the increase threshold. And then of the remaining communities, there's going to be a median cutoff. So if you're in the top half of the remaining high demand communities, you're going to get on a sliding scale an increase. If you're on the bottom half of that, you're going to get a slight decrease. And so again, really only looking at high demand areas that are not building is the intent here. And I'm sure this will continue to be looked at, but that's how they're measuring the benchmarks and who is impacted. And again, that's only for the CDBG entitlement communities.
Thanks, Nick. This question is from Colleen Ackerman. Will removing some of the requirements for manufactured housing, such as the chassis, and making them more permanent types of homes, allowing them to increase in equity and have impacts to how those types of structures are assessed for tax purposes? We've seen values increase significantly on these types of homes, but are there concerns that taxes may be unaffordable for those who can afford to purchase and install a manufacturing unit on a parcel of land?
It's a great question. There's actually a couple questions in there, I think. So let me see if I can start at the beginning here. So these homes are permanent, and the reason why the federal law changed is because less than 3% of the homes actually get removed. again, right? So the way to think about this is they are permanent homes already. They're already permanently affixed. The axles and wheels are cut off. So that isn't a massive change necessarily, but what it does allow it to do is to not have that underlying structure that has to sit on top of a slab. It can literally be placed directly onto the slab or directly onto a frost wall foundation or a foundation going forward. It also allows for stacking, right? Because you don't have to make room for that chassis piece. So that is the difference. And that chassis then can be recycled and used on another home, so helping to reduce some costs there. As far as the assessed for tax purposes, in New Hampshire, these have been considered real estate for a very long time, and they have been appreciating assets for a very long time. Actually, in the past 5 or more years, there's been several studies showing that manufactured homes have appreciated faster than traditional homes. And so you are absolutely pointing to a problem that manufactured homeowners, just like all homeowners in the state, are facing, in that as the values go up, your tax assessment is also going to go up with those increases in values. Does that create an affordability issue? Yes. And I think that's one of the even more important reasons why, a lot of people are trying to downsize out of the larger homes, trying to find a smaller option that will help them to be able to age in place in their communities. It will continue no matter what type of housing you have. As our housing values go up and our homes appreciate, we will continue to squeeze the assessment by the towns on taxes. That is our New Hampshire model, and it isn't ubiquitous to manufactured homes. It's all homes, especially as commercial values, non-residential homes have not appreciated as quickly as residential has in the past several years. So that's just shifting some of that tax burden from commercial properties to residential properties in New Hampshire.
Thanks, Sarah. Anybody else want to take this question? Okay. This is from Judy Lodo from Catch Neighborhood Housing. We have young people who have recently graduated from college and they're being offered jobs in New Hampshire at a decent starting salary, but they one that will still qualify them for low income housing tax credit property. They can't qualify because they don't have because of the HUD LHTC rules, because they're under 24 years old and still defined as a full-time student, even though they graduated as they spent any part of 5 calendar months during the year as a student. So there's a gap where young professionals who can't afford housing otherwise are being offered jobs that support New Hampshire's economy, but are barred from reasonable rents. So what are your thoughts on that?
That's the problem. Let's fix it. I mean, I think, Judy, but you bring up a good point of like this bill, there's a lot in here. There's a lot that's not in here. And so I think for those who are still running into federal regulatory barriers, please keep sending them along, send them to us, send them to the federal delegation. What we've heard repeatedly from members of both parties on this and all across the country is that they want this to be the start of housing legislation, not the end. And so if there are things in here like that you wish were that you didn't see in there, please keep sending them along. I mean, Jack brought up the Build America, Buy America challenges with housing development, and we hear this over and over and over again from affordable housing developers. And that is an area that we know there are folks who are continuing to work on that, trying to make sure that that process gets either reformed or back to its intention, which was really roads, bridges, infrastructure, and not housing development. And so that's another one where we've seen that's a federal regulatory change that there's a lot of interest in continuing to work on. So Judy, appreciate you bringing that up, and let's definitely talk more about how that we can try and get that into a future proposal.
Thanks, Nick. This is a question from Jennifer Utkin. Will there be better financing options for tiny homes on wheels or construction loans for tiny homes?
I can give that one a shot too. The benefit of I gave a presentation on this bill yesterday, and so you had a nice warm up for everybody here. So it's a good question, Jennifer. So in section 302, which is within some of the manufactured housing sort of provisions, but it's actually not a manufactured housing provision, it's a modular housing provision. It directed HUD to conduct a review for financing for FHA insured lending products that hit modular homes or other innovative housing types. And so what they're really trying to do is say, we don't really know exactly what some of the other construction innovation pieces will continue to look like, but trying to create a review process so that, again, if we find a barrier that says, we can't finance tiny homes, or that 3D printed homes or have a barrier here, that there will be future work on this. And I think this is an area when we think about implementation and following this through, all of these other pieces that are directing HUD to do something, there will be some real, I think, accountability to just make sure that that process continues to happen and that we see the provisions that are outlined here and that we can continue to make progress on them.
Thanks, Nick. We have about 5 minutes for some closing comments, and you guys can address it however you feel. But one question I would have is if there's a 21st Century Road to Housing Act Part 2, is there something, what would you really want to see in there that you didn't see in this bill?
So as Nick mentioned, at the college, and at the Housing Initiative, we do an annual poll on voter attitudes on affordable housing, and have been doing it for several years. And we have seen tremendous change in the attitude of the electorate on how we should be addressing this specific problem. 8 out of 10 voters support the state taking action to address the affordable housing crisis. We've seen a 30 point bump in folks who think we need planning reform in their own backyards. And the electorate tends to be always a little ahead of policymakers themselves, and that's probably a good democratic process. But when the the opposition can be well organized and can be a well organized minority. So I think that the public has demonstrated that it wants change, and you don't get this kind of bipartisan bill coming out of Congress without that kind of electoral support. But as Nick said, it doesn't do everything, and it really has a thematic lens around addressing supply, addressing building, um, and looking at all the ingredients and the tools that go into that. But it still doesn't address the vulnerability of extremely low income. And I think there could be an argument that the flexibility of some of these programs could challenge the resources available to extremely low income, extremely vulnerable. And so I think there'll be, if there was a part 2, I think that those specific populations, whether that's that student that someone talked about who can't get into a LIHTC development, or the single parent, or making sure that we have an expanded resources for our public housing authorities to address their supply and to grow their supply. I think if you went back and looked at it through the lens of population, you could add to this good foundation for moving forward.
Thank you, Alyssa.
Mike,
Go ahead. Go ahead, Jack.
thanks. I would say Road to Housing 2.0 should be about funding, right? This is a massive bill that addresses supply side issues, which are absolutely critical, right? That's step number one. Get rid of the barriers, the obstacles, the bottlenecks, all that. Make it easier to build, right? But funding has been flat for a long time. And so, for instance, our agency administers the Housing Choice Voucher or Section 8 program for all the areas in the state that aren't within the territory or service area of public housing authorities. And, what we found is rents keep going up, but the funding for our vouchers isn't keeping up. And so we've got a wait list of like 7 years right, for people who just desperately need help to be able to pay their rent. And now we're not able to even issue new vouchers. And so we're falling further behind. And, some of these other programs that I mentioned, like the home program, is phenomenal. It used to be funded at 1.5 billion, then it got cut to 1.25 billion. It should be, in my opinion, at 3 billion at this point. I mean, because it's a proven program. It's a cost-effective public-private partnership. But I guess my point is we are not going to solve the housing crisis without investing more federal dollars.
Thanks, Jack. Sarah.
Yeah, I was going to say the appropriations pieces that now need to be funded that directly address a lot of the items that were called out in this bill. There's really good programs that were called out in Road to Housing that need appropriations. And so step 2 is making sure that those appropriations.
Thanks, Sarah. And lastly, Nick.
Yeah, I would totally echo the appropriations piece and the infrastructure elements too. And when we think about the appropriations, also a big part of that is like, how do we upgrade our water and sewer infrastructure? How do we make sure that things that are at existing capacity or starting to break down are also funded, because that's critical for, some of the more, highly concentrated development. And then I do think there are still some regulatory reform pieces that are out there. We hit on the Build America, Buy America, the BABA piece. I mean, that is really being a roadblock to basically any federal housing funding right now, putting that to use. And so that really needs to be addressed, or just putting more money behind, the existing roadblocks is a challenge. But I think this is a great first step, and really excited about the continued effort here.
Great. Thanks, Nick. And we're out of time here. So I want to thank our sponsor, the Initiative for Housing Policy and Practice at Saint Anselm College. And thanks to our panelists, Nick Taylor, Sarah Marchant, Jack Ruderman, Alyssa Margolin. Thank you so much. And thank you from the Hampshire Business Review.
Thank
A
you.
recording of today's presentation will soon be available at hbr.com. You'll also catch it in your email tomorrow. Thank you so much.